Um, I have the captions turned on and they will not turn off now. That's okay. I'll just leave them on there. All right. So today we are going to continue in the series we started last week about how roles shift as caregivers get deeper into the trenches. Um, Last week we talked about role creep, about scope, about responsibilities you never asked for. And this week, we're going to talk about some of the emotional weather that is that kind of develops as we navigate our role shift. Okay, so last week we talked about the role itself, and today we're going to talk about how that shift can show up in our bodies, in our day-to-day life. Okay. But before I get into the content, I want to remind everyone that today is our education stipend opportunity. What does that mean? Well, that means that for participating today as a way to maybe offset respite costs or just as a thank you for taking time out of your day to spend an hour with me, we are going to offer everyone a $25 check or stipend. And all you have to do is fill out the post survey that I will send you after today's webinar. In order to get that, you have to put your email address in the chat box. And there are a few rules. This is available to anyone who is currently an unpaid family caregiver. So any agency or community representatives on the webinar today will not be eligible. And also, it is one stipend per household, okay? So if you and maybe a friend or spouse or somebody of the same household are on the call today, I'm so happy for that, but only one stipend per household, please, okay? And you have to fill the survey out within 24 hours of me sending it, okay? So if I send it out today, it has to be completed by tomorrow evening, okay? All right. So let's get into the content today. From family member to caregiver, navigating the shift. So why is it important to do this today? Well, because I think you all are way too hard on yourselves. I've been doing this job for a little while, and it seems like the same themes creep up over and over and over again. Why is this hard? Why am I tired? Why am I frustrated? Why am I terrified? Let me turn my heat off real quick. And in those questions is a very human answer because you're a human being doing a hard thing, okay? And even if some of my information sounds repetitive to you, please know I did that on purpose, okay? Because sometimes we hear things, but we don't digest them until we taste them over and over and over again, okay? So I want to validate your experience. I want to normalize your experience. And I want to humanize your experience as best as I can today, okay? So we all know that caregiving is not a job you typically apply for. It's not one that you dust off the resume and put on LinkedIn and say, sign me up, right? And it doesn't even happen overnight. Sometimes it does, right? Sometimes your loved one has an emergency or a diagnosis happens right at birth, right? And so you know these things are coming and it is kind of like an overnight thing. But for most of you, it's a slow burn, right? It's one task added and then another task added and then another task added. And then all of a sudden you're fully in it, right? And that's what we talked about last week was that role creep, right? Where the responsibilities kind of just start showing up on your plate, right? So it can happen very slowly or very quickly, but often it starts because of love, right? You love someone enough to help them with a favor, to give them a ride to an appointment, right? And then one day you realize, hey, I'm not just visiting this space, I actually live here now, right? Not only do I live in this, I am responsible for this, right? And so you're trying to kind of adjust to the new role and the new tasks of that role. And we often forget that there is an emotional shift that also has to take place. The relationship dynamics change, okay? And so we're just going to kind of name that moment, right? Where we shift from family member into caregiver, okay? And we understand that a little bit better, then we're less likely to be confused why we feel the way we feel. We're less likely to blame ourselves for feeling overwhelmed or unprepared or underprepared, right? Um, and so this can be a very subtle change, but it can also make you feel like you didn't really have a choice in it. And so your responsibility um, can definitely harbor some resentment if you don't acknowledge the emotional shift that takes place, right? It can be very, very disorienting. But of course, that's just how things happen, right? Relationships change, whether you're a caregiver or not, okay? And so being mindful of that and giving ourselves a little grace through that transition can make all the difference for us, okay? So today we're going to talk about that shift, and I'm going to hopefully try to give you a little bit of language for it, because language really does matter, not only in how other people interact with us and how we communicate our needs, but also internally, right? Our brains are very quick to label things for us, and we can use language as a tool to make sure those labels make sense, okay? Make sure those roles stay separate, or at least the bleed over is minimal. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so we talked about role confusion last week. I'm just going through my notes, I'm sorry. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the roles just as a recap, okay? So many caregivers are holding these two roles at once. Family member, which holds emotion, history, patterns, love, right? And then the caregiver, which is coordination, decisions, advocacy, logistics, sometimes being the bad guy, right? And so those roles overlapping without any clarity, and those boundaries start to blur, that can be very stressful. Okay. That's where we can kind of get into that sticky scenario of, yes, this is mom, but she's also, under my care, right? And there's an authority shift that happens that can be very uncomfortable and disorienting. Okay. And so I just want to really validate that for you, that if you are feeling some of that tension or even some of that resentment, there's nothing wrong with you. Okay. You're a human being. And so you're trying to be, a daughter and a case manager in the same body, right? Or a husband and, a caregiver at the same time. And so that relationship is still there, but the role has changed. And so it can be very, very confusing and stressful. Okay. But again, it's not a character flaw. That's just the math of your scenario, right? All right. So when the relationship changes, it can start to feel different. Okay. And I want to be mindful with my words here because I don't want to label anybody's experience. I don't want to presume anybody's experience, but this is just based off of things that I've witnessed as a caregiver wellness advocate and a therapist in this role. Okay. So in a caregiving role, you're still somebody's child, you're still a spouse, you're still a sibling, you're still a parent, right? But you're also an advocate, a decision maker, a coordinator, sometimes the one who says no. And that relationship will start to feel very different. And it's very common to miss how relationships used to be. Or for those of you who have been caregiving since day one of your child's life, it's okay to miss or grieve the expectation maybe that you had of what that role would look like for you going forward. Okay. And we really don't talk about that enough. And I think sometimes when we think of the word grief, we just think of it almost like a taboo subject, or we think, oh, we only grieve when somebody's passed away. But that's not true. Grief exists like most things on a spectrum. Okay. And so caregiving doesn't just add tasks to your day to day, it changes the way the relationship feels, right? And so you're going to love your person very, very deeply, but at the same time, you're managing them, okay? And especially if you think of a parent-child relationship or a spouse relationship, that's very taboo territory, right? No one wants to be managed by their equal. And so when you have to remind somebody or negotiate or make decisions for somebody, enforcing those limits, that can feel very, very strange. And there can be a lot of grief in that. Okay. Sometimes you might feel more like a nurse than a child, or you feel like a manager of a household instead of a spouse. And so that quiet sense of grief just kind of creeps in over time, and you might not even realize that that's what you're experiencing. Okay. Maybe you're missing when you could just be a family member, right? Where you can just sit and spend time with your loved one and not have to manage their life and not have to manage all the balls in the air, right? And so maybe you miss just spending time without having to be a caregiver, and that's normal, right? So I want to gently suggest that maybe you're not just tired, maybe you are grieving, okay? Maybe you're grieving while you're cooking dinner, grieving while you're on hold with the insurance company, grieving someone who's still sitting in that room with you, right? That's a very strange and invisible sorrow, and you might not even realize that that's what it is, okay? Maybe you just think, why am I snapping all the time? Why am I so emotional? Why am I missing something that I cannot explain, right? So this doesn't mean, of course, that you're ungrateful or uncaring. It just means that something very meaningful has changed. There is a shift that has taken place. And again, it's very common. And that sense of loss is a form of grief. Okay. We can grieve while things are changing. Okay. Our culture likes to add grief into this one little shade, right? But we know that it can be a whole rainbow of hues, right? And so you can grieve the version of the relationship you used to have. You can grieve for the ease in that relationship that you used to have, right? Like me and my husband used to talk all the time, and now he barely says a word, right? We used to go on trips. We used to go to the movies. We used to do all these things. And now it's just task, 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 right? That's grief, right? You're allowed to feel that loss and you're allowed to process through it. You're allowed to feel sad that you used to move with this person and now you're responsible for this person. Okay, that's a huge shift. Okay, and it's a quiet grief that is ongoing. Okay, and when it doesn't have a name, of course, it's going to show up as other things like irritability and guilt, right? So I just want to invite you to maybe consider that there is maybe some grief underneath those feelings, and it's not just you being angry all the time. And it might not be just a matter of, I need a break, right? Maybe it's a matter of, I need to process and name it for what it is, okay? Again, I'm not putting words in anyone's mouth. This is just what I've observed, okay? It could be grief. So again, we don't really have a moment where we say, I'm a caregiver now, right? It just kind of builds over time. Responsibilities increase gradually. Family dynamics can stay the same, but the duties change underneath them, okay? And that unspoken shift often leaves you unprepared for what you're taking on, right? And so that lack of clear starting point can make it really difficult to notice when things have changed, and again, harder to ask for support, right? And so one of the things that we can do that's very simple and very, very powerful is language. What language do we use? Okay. So when everything is just, well, I'm just doing what any good family member would do, I'm just doing what family does. Yes, that's very true. But in that language, it makes it very, very easy for setting limits to feel like you're being selfish, right? Well, this is what I'm supposed to do. Yes, but you're still a human being, okay? And you're allowed to set boundaries and you're allowed to be a little selfish every once in a while, okay? So when we use the language of, I'm in a caregiving role right now, right? Something shifts, something becomes visible, becomes real and legitimate, right? So yes, I am daughter, but I'm putting on my caregiver role right now, okay? I'm clocking in, okay? And of course, when you have a role, you can discuss that role, like we spoke about a little bit last week, right? You can have boundaries. You can share roles when they're defined as roles and not just a dutiful thing that you do because you're family, okay? So naming doesn't remove the love. It doesn't remove the fact that you are a loving and caring family member, but it just helps separate the love from the logistics a little bit, okay? And the reason why, because this creates that breathing room, okay? It gives you a little bit of space to say, okay, in the doctor's office, I'm caregiver, but in front of the TV while we're eating dinner or at the table playing a puzzle, I'm spouse, I'm mom, I'm child, right? And if sure, there's going to be some caregiving things that creep into that, but allowing yourself the permission to say, I'm in relationship right now, not management. Internally, that can do a lot for you and your stress, and it can help with that grief, right? Because then you don't realize you're not focusing on what is lost, you're focusing on what remains and what can be built upon. Okay. Yes, the relationship has changed, but it's still there. Okay. And that's very important for you to know that. So, you know this through lived experience. I don't have to tell you, but I will anyway. When you are both a family member and a caregiver, you are often pulled in many different directions, right? Um, as a family member, you can expect emotional presence, availability, relational closeness, right? We're having fun, we're getting to know each other, we're planting good seeds, right? But caregiving, on the other hand, requires coordination, follow through, decision making, sometimes enforcing limits, right? It's very task oriented, very task heavy. And those roles don't always want the same thing at the same time, okay? And this is why boundaries get really difficult to maintain because as a caregiver, you might feel guilty for being practical when emotions are running high or being emotionally unavailable when tasks need to be done, right? And that internal conflict is not a sign of you being cold or failing. It's just a sign that there are two different roles that are operating internally at the same time. Okay. And that can be cognitively exhausting and emotionally exhausting, physically exhausting. And when we don't understand what's happening, then we just start to beat ourselves up for being so tired all the time, right? Or being so snippy because we're burnt out, right? And it's when we think about the energy and effort it takes our brain to switch from one role to the next, we start to understand that and we can give ourselves grace. Okay. So if you're sitting at a doctor's appointment, you're switching between, daughter and advocate in the same breath, right? You're trying to comfort your spouse while also tracking medications and insurance calls, right? You want to just visit, but mentally you're just running those checklists the whole time. And so you don't get to like separate the roles because they're entwined so much, right? Maybe you feel guilty for setting limits, but then you also feel guilty when you don't. Okay. That's hard. That's confusing, right? Maybe, you're feeling a lot of love. You love someone very, very deeply, but you're still tired and frustrated and lonely, right? And they show up, these shifts, they show up in really ordinary moments, right? So in an appointment, you're suddenly not just family, you're translating medical language and asking questions and taking notes and coordinating, right? Or if you go to spend time with somebody, but then half your brain is running about, logistics about refills and forms and follow-ups, you're not fully present there. You can't be, right? Or sometimes you have to tell, no, we can't do that, or this isn't safe. And you feel like the bad guy, even though you're just trying to help somebody, right? And sometimes they tell you you're the bad guy, right? I'm still the mom, right? And you can feel guilty both ways, right? Guilty when you set limits, guilty when you don't, guilty when you do take somebody out, and then guilty when you don't. And so that's kind of like emotional whiplash, and it's very, very common, okay? And the reason why I say this to you is not to tell you about your life, but to maybe let you realize that this is a common experience. Okay. It is not unnatural or out of the ordinary for you to feel these conflicting emotions over the same thing. Okay. That contributes to your exhaustion. That contributes to your frustration. That contributes to your sadness, your loneliness, what have you. Okay. Because it's not cut and dry. So again, words, language, these can be our best friends, okay? Naming to yourself when you're in caregiver mode versus family mode. And again, I know there will be overlap. I know there will be bleed, but this is something you can do internally just to kind of, flip from day shift to night shift, so to speak, right? You're just kind of flipping the sign, okay, on the diner. So be intentional about creating moments that are just relationships and not task. Why? Because this allows you to be in relationship with your loved one in a more present way. Okay. Say your responsibilities out loud instead of carrying them silently in your head. Okay. Right now, I'm caregiving. Right now, I'm building relationship. Okay. Share the roles when it's possible, even in little ways, right? Notice your feelings without judging them. This is very important. Okay. Mixed emotions are very, very normal in these roles. Okay. I want to be doing this. I don't want to do this. Right. I'm the only one that can do this. I wish somebody else would. Right. That's very normal. And so when we notice those feelings, it's very human of us to judge them and to shame them and try to explain them. Okay. But just noticing them without judging them normalizes them. It helps you to understand them and it helps you to digest and process them a little bit better. Okay. So we can't remove the complexity of this role. Okay. But we can try to make it less confusing. So even just saying, right now I'm in caregiver mode. This helps your brain understand why you feel more practical or boundaried in that moment, right? You're not feeling less caring, you're just shifting roles so that the task at hand can be addressed properly, right? Maybe try to protect small pockets of time that are just for relationship, okay? After dinner, we're just going to sit down and watch this show together, right? After we've, showered for the morning, we're going to sit and have our coffee together, right? Where we're not coordinating anything. We're just there, right? Just in the relationship, even just for 10 minutes. Okay. That can matter because it gives your system that time to recalibrate and to reorient and to be nourished by the relationship, even if it has changed. Okay. Because your person isn't a task, it's a relation, they're a relationship, right? They're a person you love, they're a person you care about. And so when we neglect that side of it, it'll wither, right? And that's not what we want, right? When things are invisible and live only in our head, they get very, very heavy, right? And so when we name it, it's shareable. We can understand it. We can ask for help, okay? So again, I want to normalize this for you. You are allowed to have mixed feelings, okay? Love and frustration can sit in the same room together, all right? Gratitude and exhaustion can coexist. And that doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It just means that you are a human being. We are very complex creatures, right? For better or for worse. So again, we don't want to judge ourselves. We just want to normalize. We want to feel our feelings, notice them, not shame ourselves for them, okay? So what can this look like in real life? Again, you could be in a doctor's office answering questions about your mom's health history and then realize that you know more about the chart than she does, right? You're trying to be warm and reassuring while also translating that language and making decisions. So that's a dual role, right? Maybe a spouse who used to be a partner in everything now is coordinating medications, appointments, finances, still loving very, very deeply, but sometimes feeling like a manager and not an equal, missing that partnership. Maybe you're a parent supporting a child whose needs grow more complex over time. And so you're trying to balance protection and independence at the same time and wondering where's the line? How am I helping or am I over functioning? Right? Am I hindering their independence or am I acting as a trellis so that they can gain their footing? Right? That can be very exhausting mentally. Or maybe you're a sibling who just kind of defaulted to the organizer role because you're the one who's available, right? And so you're scheduling and updating everyone and caring a lot more than anyone realizes, right? So in each of these scenarios, the relationship is still there and the love is still there, but that added layer of responsibility just changes how things show up and how they feel, right? And that's normal. And it's okay to address that. And it's okay to be confused by that. So how do we bring more clarity into this space if we're confused, right? When these things are overlapping, right? So once you have language for the shift, you can start making those small adjustments, right? So we're not asking for anything dramatic. We're just asking for things that help you steady yourself and steady the footing in this dual role, okay? Um, so again, using that language, I'm in caregiver role, right? That helps you explain or understand why you're feeling more practical, more boundary, why you have to say no and mean it, right? And that can be hard. But that's the caregiver role, right? That's not necessarily the relationship, okay? Um, Finding those little pockets of time where you can just be child, you can just be spouse, you can just be family, okay? We kind of talked about that already. And saying those responsibilities out loud, right? I need help in these areas because I'm drowning in this shift, or I need help with the logistics of appointments so that I can have more time to sit and be in relationship. Okay. And so delegation can be your best friend. And if you have no one you can delegate these tasks to, that's why even just kind of trading the hats, right? Well, caregiver Jenny is going to do this so that wife Jenny can do that. Okay. And that can help you feel a lot more balanced. Okay. So here's a few things that you can take away with you. And I've got plenty of time. I do have a worksheet I want to share with you as well. But I think it's important for us to have time after the presentation to turn off the recording and have a conversation. That's how we build community and that's how we learn from one another. And so I'm going to give you a few takeaways and then we'll start the discussion, okay? So caregiving does not just add tasks to your plate, it changes the shape of the relationship that you have with somebody. Okay. And that can be very, very disorienting because the love is still there, but how you navigate is going to be different. Right. So you have to learn a new dance. If you've ever felt guilty, conflicted, tired, or even resentful at times, that doesn't mean you don't love your loved one enough. It just means you're carrying a lot without clear language or support, okay? And there's nothing wrong with you, okay? You're responding to a very complex role in a very human way, right? It's disorienting. You have to find your footing. You have to be intentional about that in the next steps that you take, right? Next takeaway, sometimes the most powerful shift isn't doing more things. It's just being able to say, this is caregiving and it's hard. Okay. Too often we have this, I don't know, expectation, whether it's from society or from ourselves, that if you love somebody, this role is easy. You just kind of slide into it. Um, yes and no. Yes, it's easy to love. But yes, it's also hard. Okay. It can be very complex. It can be very exhausting, right? And it's okay to yearn for that time where you could just be mom and not logistics manager of all these extra things, right? Or you yearn for that time where you can just be wife or spouse or husband, right? And not have to be caretaker and not have to be bather and feeder and dresser, right? That's normal and that's hard and it's grief, okay? And it's okay to call it that, even if somebody is still alive right next to you, okay? You can grieve the change, you can grieve the shift, you can grieve the new responsibilities, and you can grieve the idea of what things were supposed to be or could have been that no longer are, right? That's very human. And when we don't address it for what it is, it becomes something that's more difficult to manage, like resentment, okay? So I hope this has left you with a little more clarity and a little less self-blame, right? A little more gentleness, a little more capacity for self-compassion, okay? So you deserve that. You deserve help. You deserve compassion, okay? And so I don't want you to feel like you're failing if this is hard. Of course it's hard, okay? Of course it's hard. You are, the reason why another person is still living in a lot of ways, right? Or is still capable to be themselves because you are the scaffolding that they're building themselves up on, right? You're the trellis and they're kind of like the vine, and that can be very tiring sometimes. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful, um, but it can be exhausting, and it's okay that you feel that it's exhausting. Okay. All right. Here's my contact info, my office number, my email, and our website. If you are not part of the newsletter, and maybe you found this link registered through our social media accounts, if you go to alabamarespite.org, you can sign up for our newsletter. I just send one a month, and it's just all the trainings that we have. If you need to call for information about our respite reimbursement program, or if you want to schedule a care chat with me, which is just a one-on-one conversation, just to kind of release some of that steam a little bit, maybe get some clarity or some resources, you can do that. I also am taking clients for one-on-one therapy sessions, and it is free of charge. So if you are interested in participating in that, or if you just have questions, you can call or email me, and I'm more than happy to answer questions for you. And if your loved one is also wanting some therapy supports or some counseling, we have another counselor on staff named Kendra, and she is, her grant actually covers care recipients. Okay. And so, of course, that is across the lifespan. So if you have a kiddo, if you have an adult in your life that you're caring for, and they are wanting some therapy services, please reach out. We can get you started, or at least, again, answer questions if you have them. Okay. All right.